I'd like you maybe, last question before we turn to the audience, just to say, you've mentioned Africa in passing. And you know, what the traditional view of Africa is, you know, a lot of people think Africa is hopeless. But you've argued for a larger voice for Africa, and that you have suggested tonight, and I'd like you to elaborate on a little bit more, that Africa is actually taking part in this surge of growth in the developing world, at least in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And if that's true, what are the implications for traditional development assistance? And with all due respect to Bono and Jeffrey Sachs, is there something patronizing and anachronistic about their thinking on development? Sorry about that.
Well, let me start with sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, there's a huge diversity here. You have about 900 million people. But if I try to give you a framework to think about this, I look at the countries of sub-Saharan Africa in three categories. One, you have about a third of the population that live in countries that prior to the crisis had grown on average of about 6% a year for the prior 10 years. Not too bad. And what those countries are looking for are frankly what Europe was looking for 50 years ago. They want energy, infrastructure, healthy private sector, regional integration linked to global markets, and to a degree, can we use the agricultural sector to increase productivity and income as a consumption base. So there's a certain set of issues related to trying to support those countries on the path. There's another third of the population that was actually growing in countries at about 9%, but they were primarily based on energy resources. And for them, going back to your point on governance, the real question is the governance and development. How do they make sure that they have an inclusive growth, they don't have an enclave economy? How do they make sure the money isn't stolen? How to make sure that, so it's really the governance as opposed to financing is critical. And the last third, which is a tragic category that Paul Collier has highlighted with his work called the bottom billion, is the fragile and post-conflict states. So these are the countries that not only affect their own population, but we have the data that if you're a country living next to them, it undercuts your growth by about 1.5% a year. So this was the Liberias, the Southern Sudans, the Afghanistans, the Haitis. And one of the things that I launched at the bank, given my sort of multiple background, was to see how we could try to approach these countries more effectively. And in some ways, while this is an overstatement, the development community had treated these as simply harder cases of development. And what I really think is necessary is an integration of security, development, and governance, ultimately building legitimacy. And what struck me, given the fact I'd worked in trade or nuclear security issues, was the state of the analytical art in how you combine these was pretty rudimentary. And so we actually do a big world development report every year, and this year we're going to do it on this particular issue. And if you think about the importance of this, back to a U.S. audience, you know, this is the story of Afghanistan, what you're reading about, is, you know, how are you going to be able to build, you know, an education system, a self-sustaining agriculture, a state, the judiciary systems. So, or frankly, this is the story of Haiti, how you're going to have Haiti repaired. So it's a critical area for the international community as a whole to get better at trying to how to deal with. And let me give you an example of the sort of question you unearth out of this. When I was in Afghanistan about a year ago and I was talking to members of the business community, I asked them, what's your number one concern? And they said, the police. And I said, well, what in particular? They said, well, the police are predators, not protectors. So I then started to look around to say, well, where in the international system can you find trainers for police? You could find trainers for armies. But interestingly enough, until relatively recently, when the UN Peacekeeping Office started to develop this capability, there really wasn't a place you could go to get training for police. Italy has the Carabinieri, who have done very well, so they're kind of brought in on a spot basis. But these are the sort of issues which you identify that say, well, if we care about this, we better figure out, you know, how to develop this capacity in some institution to do. So coming back to sub-Saharan Africa, you know, some days I deal with people that say, oh, is it hopeless? And other days I deal with people that say, gee, is China going to come in and take it over? Well, if China's interested, obviously there's something there of interest, right? And it's not only natural resources. Increasingly, and this is where this opportunity could come in from China, is that there was the party secretary in Guangdong province, a man named Wang Yang, who had been party secretary in Chongqing before that, one of the rising stars. At the start of the financial crisis, he said something that got him slapped down a little bit from Beijing, but it's persisted. He said, you know what? Maybe at the end of this crisis, we should not return to jobs producing footwear and toys. Maybe we should move up the value-added chain. And that's exactly what's going to start to happen there, and that's what you're going to start to see with the higher wage rates. So I went and talked with the Ministry of Commerce in China and some others and said, is there a possibility that you might be interested if we create some industrial zones in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, if we create the electricity, we create the ports and system, to be able to invest, have some of that investment in sub-Saharan Africa, or it may be in places in Southeast Asia. And you start to see an interest in exploring that. Now, this is not going to happen overnight, but this could be a very important development, because for those of us in the development field, frankly, if you looked at the history of East Asia's development, export-led growth with Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Southeast Asia and to China, one worried, could Africa even follow this model because there was going to be so much of a dominant role for China? This shows a little break in this, a little possibility. So again, coming back to your point about growth models, in some ways I think one has to understand how the environment changes and be pragmatic about taking opportunities. On the comment about Bono and Jeff, you know, I'll say this. I honestly think Bono is. I've developed a lot of admiration for Bono, and one of the things that I admired. This was not the typical perspective of the NGO development community. He was open to the notion of openness and free trade, and he actually was of help on that, as well as trying to highlight some of the other issues. And frankly, I think, you know, some of these people get into this because it might be part of their reputational or their brand. He's a very committed person to it. Jeff brings a different perspective, but it's an important one. Jeff is a person who's pretty hard-headed about the importance of return, for example, anti-malaria. And look, the anti-malaria initiative that he helped launch, I was at the State Department at the time, and I helped push through the U.S. government side, you know, has made a difference in millions and millions of deaths. I mean, and you know, there's still room to go, but this is a huge type of change. Jeff personally believes, but this is what political debates are about, was that there should be a much larger sort of governmental investment in some of these activities. And you know, I think there's going to debates about the usage of that, but I think he's doing it for a good reason. Here's the category that I sometimes get a little frustrated with, and it's not those two. Now and then you have some in the NGO community, and you have to distinguish, because a lot of the NGOs are key delivery providers or key advocates. But in some ways, they bring their view of moral certainty to developing countries. In some ways, I think it doesn't give the developing countries their due regard. Take energy. It's pretty darn hard to develop if you don't have energy or electricity. And you know, in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you have 10–15% of the people have access to electricity. One of the issues I have to fight in Europe is people who, for example, don't want building any dams, okay, because of the environmental effects of dams. Well, if you're trying to move to a low-carbon environment, you can get a certain amount, perhaps over time, from solar and wind and biofuels. But if I look at dam development in North America or the United States, it's gone pretty far. And there's huge possibilities for hydropower development. Now, I believe that we need to work with countries on the environmental effects, on the local community effects. But to say you shouldn't build dams is to consign people not to live with electricity. Now, we're going to have other issues on this related to fossil fuels, and this is another sensitive topic. But what I think I found, and this goes back to your comment about the third world, some of the best response I got on that comment was from developing countries in Africa, because they didn't like being treated as a residual. They wanted to be treated in the same way that other countries have, but ones that are at a different stage of development. And so I think, again, one of the aspects of a different international system is let Africans speak for Africa. And that's part of what we're also trying to create in these new institutions.
Great. Well, you know, we have a number of heavy hitters here in the audience. I'm going to call upon a few of them before we break. And the first one is Henry Kaufman, who wrote a book just last year called The Road to financial reformation. I think Henry is sitting over here, and there's going to be a mic there, so maybe he could ask the first question.
Well, Bob, I want to take you back to the financial markets, if you don't mind. It seems to me that your presentation suggests that you are financially constrained in the traditional sense, because the industrial nations in Europe, the United States, and Japan are borrowing a huge amount on their own. They're deficit countries. So by that very nature, they cannot be willing to be as supportive of the World Bank as they have been in the past. So it would seem to me, therefore, that you're going to have to continue to innovate in non-financing projects rather than being an ongoing big lender. Now, if I also follow your analysis that gradually the emerging world is going to become part of the bigger world, don't you think in 2 decades from now, the president of the World Bank is going to be someone other than an American?
Well, as for the second one, it may very well be earlier than 2 decades from now. And just so you know, there's a very, very strong aspect of this question about voice in the debate. And maybe that's a good thing. I'll just share this perspective, which I recognize as a slight parochial one, but, and that is, look, I've spent my career trying to make sure that the United States stays engaged in the world. And I've had to fight protectionism and isolationism of different sorts. And I think that there's a benefit to having members of Congress and others engaged through the World Bank. And insofar as there's a U.S. leader of it, I frankly think that helps. Now, that may not be good enough, but I think it's something that people shouldn't treat lightly. I mean, the United States is still a very big contributor to IDA, which is the funds that have to be raised every 3 years for the poorest countries. So these will be decided by the countries themselves. But I guess at the same time that people think, what I sometimes hear is quite interesting, is maybe the president should not be an American, but I hope it doesn't also mean that it can't be an American. And also, when I think about multilateral organizations, this is where I'm a little bit of a hard-headed realist. You know, I don't think you're going to see an American UN Secretary General. There's a lot of international organizations where when I watched how it works, it's as much a matter of politics as it is some theory of merit. So those are going to be the issues that countries have to engage with and kind of find their balance over time. But I think the basic trend, it's a good thing. I mean, I just brought in for the level below me, one of the astounding finance ministers of the world, Sri Mulyani Indrawati from Indonesia, has been a fantastic reformer. Another one is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who did the same thing in Nigeria. And I think this is fantastic. So this is the direction we certainly need to try to move. But at the same time, I don't want the United States to disengage from these processes. Now, on the financing issue, you raise a number of points. First off, I think that, and this is another fortunate thing, I got an Italian chief financial officer who comes from the central banking system of Italy. He's done a fantastic job. We've come out of this financial crisis in very good condition. Our borrowing's very good. With this additional capital, we will be able to do additional borrowing lending. And part of the point that I made to the developed world was the beneficial multiplier effect for them. And let me just give you a slight further example. Of course, we finance projects based on what the clients want, but insofar as we've had some focus in this crisis, it's tended to be on 3 things. One is infrastructure, because we learned the lesson of China in the 1990s, that if you can invest in infrastructure, you can create jobs and build future productivity. If you look at investment lending in developing countries, about 50% of it is spent on capital goods, the type of capital goods that are built in developed countries. So there's a win-win prospect here. You get investment in growth opportunities, removing bottlenecks in developing countries. You create the possibilities for exports and jobs in developed countries. The second area is learning another lesson from the 90s financial crisis, which is that macroeconomic stability alone isn't enough. And that what I mean by that is if you don't have basic targeted safety net programs that deal with education, nutrition, you can lose a generation. And you'll never get it back. And so one of the lessons we learned was, for example, Mexico, Brazil had things called like conditional cash transfer programs, which are wonderfully efficient for about 0.5% of GDP. They give money to the poorest, and the conditions are that kids have to go to school and people have to get health checkups. They've probably done more for women's health in Mexico than anything in the history of the country. We now have those in countries all around the world, expanding the lesson. Now, some countries didn't have the capacity to do that. So there we work with groups like the World Food Program on food for work programs, school feeding programs, but it's learning how to use the safety net support in a targeted, effective way. And one of the points I make with some U.S. colleagues, including in the Congress, is, you know what, there's some lessons the U.S. can learn about that too. And similarly in the infrastructure area, we have the Indian ambassador to the UN here. In India, it's commonplace now to think about private investment in infrastructure. But when Mitch Daniels wanted to do a long-term lease of the Indiana tollway system, it was almost his political death knell. Fortunately, it worked out quite well. He brought about $4 billion into Indiana. So let me pose this question. Everybody's talking about big debt and big problems in the States. Well, why don't you do what India does and privatize some of your infrastructure? Maybe the Indians are ahead of the U.S. on some of this. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here for people to cross-fertilize. But the last point on the markets is, we're still in a very difficult period here. I just came back from Europe. There's a lot of uncertainty in those markets, and as Carl suggested, my own view, at least as I'll say it for purposes tonight, is I think the big financial package that Europe put together bought time, but there's still challenges ahead. And the irony now is that just as 2008 in the United States caused problems for the rest of the world, the sovereign credit issue in Europe poses a challenge for the world as well.
Great. A little bit further down on the head table, Bill McDonough has a question.
Bob, my question is about corruption. In the belief that one of the great stories of the New Testament is the woman taken in adultery, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Corruption, sinfulness is something that we live with, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Is it best to go about attacking corruption by saying, let's reward good behavior, or are there certain cases in which the corruption is just so outrageous that the country has to be put on a list of those that not even the World Bank under your fine leadership can deal with?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes you do, we clearly do withdraw, and it depends the type of projects you do. It depends who you do them with. I mean, in some countries you may decide that you don't want to operate. But just to give people a feel of this from a different continent, a real life problem that we struggle with now, take Cambodia. This is a sophisticated audience. You know that Cambodia went through a genocide. If you ever go to Phnom Penh and you go see the museum there, it'll leave you with nightmares for days and days and days to see the pictures of people, what occurred there. So you have certain people in the Cambodian government who lived through something that probably nobody in this room could imagine. And probably what it's done for them in life is to think when you're on the bottom, you're nothing. You can be destroyed in a minute. When you're on top, you take what's yours. But there's other people in Cambodia that are trying to build a modern economy, trying to reform it. So, what combination, what programs, how do you support the good guys versus the other guys? And those are, some of the challenge. Now, you mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned, with some of the countries, the temptation comes from natural resource development. So there, it really isn't a question of us putting in money. It's a question of can we work with countries to try to add transparency programs, openness. And this really runs throughout the whole society. And the best anti-corruption programs that I've found are not ones where outsiders come in or investigate it, although we have to do that as well, but you bring in the local society. So let me just again give you a small example, but this could be replicated a zillion times. A program where you're giving money to schools and you simply publish on the door of the school that there is supposed to be X number of textbooks and Y number of teachers, and allows the people in the community to say, well, gee, we never got the textbooks, and we only have one teacher. We don't have two teachers. And it allows, in a sense, the civil society itself to become the watchdog. And so programs that build in civic participation as well as transparency are the ones that I find to be the most powerful. But I think you also properly pointed out, if you got corruption, there's a briber and a bribee. And a lot of the bribers have been from the developed world. So one of the initiatives that we launched, actually with my Nigerian colleague, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, is the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. And we work with the UN because it turns out that it actually is a little hard to go to some developed countries and free the millions, hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars that are stolen from corrupt leaders. So we need to make this double-sided. Also the case of companies. One of the things that I've been pleased, this is things sometimes in the international world move a little slower than you would like, but you have, in addition to the World Bank, you have regional development banks. Our way of dealing with companies that have bribed is we have a sanction system, so we borrow them from our activities for a certain period of time. One of the things we were able to accomplish was to have a joint cross-debarment with the other regional banks, because it was crazy to allow a company to deal with the Asian Development Bank but not with us. But this takes time to do, but it's a good sort of step. So you're right that corruption is a critical issue, not only because you don't want to waste money, but it's probably the most corrosive aspect of trust in a society. I mean, look, we're discussing this here in the United States with the issues of financial system, but one of the things that I talk about sometimes when I meet with our procurement officers is that not only do they have a fiduciary trust at the bank, to our shareholders and to other people who work there, but our people need to recognize how they are looked upon as a role model in the countries they're working. And if they somehow communicate that maybe you could ignore $5 here or $10 here or $50 here, that's the cost of doing business, that somebody will take away that message. And if they take away that message and it weakens the institutions in that developing country, that will be a price much greater than the money, because trust once lost is very hard to retain. So I think part of this is, again, it goes back to the first question that Carl asked. You know, a lot of development we've learned is actually the institutions and good governance. It's not just a question of the economic return on investment.
We have time for two more questions, only that. This has been really absolutely fascinating. You just talked a little bit about education, and when I was having dinner before I was meeting for the first time Irene Pritzker, who is very active in Ghana and talking about sustainable education, and I know that she has a question that she'd like to pose to you. I think she's sitting at the head table right next to, right near Bill McDonough.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you very much. Yes, I am working in education in Ghana and actually working in trying to create sustainable models of education in existing, very poor existing private schools that are not touched by any any access to credit whatsoever. What I would like to ask you is, the World Bank, like USAID and IFC and many, many other international powerful agencies pouring billions and billions of dollars into education in developing countries. There are actually no programs, no real programs other than just financing broken ministries and broken political education departments. I would like to ask you as the World Bank, are you doing anything different to this? And what do you see as a way I mean, obviously, democracy depends upon an educated population. If there isn't education, there will never be democracy. So, as the leader of the World Bank, what do you suggest that these crazy agencies around the world who are just endlessly giving billions of dollars to broken institutions might do, and what might the World Bank do to be more innovative about addressing sustainable, effective education in the developing world?
Well, first, what we try to do is be open to a variety of ideas about how to fix what's broken. And in some ways, your question is interesting. I find more willingness to innovate, including with the private sector and education in the developing world, than I find in the developed world. So, you know, when it comes time to school choice in the developed world, it strikes me as a little slower than I find in the developing world in many cases. But I think, you know, here's what I've seen more generally. The Millennium Development Goals, which I know you're well aware of, set certain targets to be achieved by 2015. And in general, what we've seen is it was useful in getting many countries to expand enrollment at the early sort of primary level, particularly girls' enrollment, often left out. But there's been a big problem in the quality. So the next challenge is how to move from numbers to improvement of the quality of the system. But there's another issue, again, referencing the private sector side, that we're now starting to see in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's quite intriguing. For many of you familiar with the process after the colonial period, you know that there was a very small educated elite in many developing countries. And so understandably, there was an effort to expand primary education and not as much investment in secondary and tertiary education. On the one hand, that's important. You want to try to broaden the base of opportunity. And we try to, we support different ways to support, private scholarships. I know we had a program in Colombia where we were helping people from poorer areas be able to, in a sense, get tuition payments. I went to an Indian program for girls that had was supporting a school academy type of area. So, we're trying to experiment with different models and learn from them. But what I'm picking up more and more in sub-Saharan Africa is a concern that they're not having broader opportunities for university education. And with technology, we are trying to see whether we can tap into some more cost-effective models using internet technology as a form of education. Some of them private sector. The president of Botswana being a more successful developing country, wanted to have a science and technology university, a private science and technology university. So we're actually trying to use private sector investment to advance this. So I think there's actually some interesting opportunities to try to develop some centers of excellence and a broader tertiary basis of Africa that's probably going to be important to move up the overall chain of development. But more broadly, coming back to your emphasis, what you, I'm sure, see in Ghana is what you can see in, in many, many poor countries where still the resources devoted to this for the number of students in a classroom, in some cases it's fundamental issues like whether there are washroom facilities available separate for girls or whether they will come. When you see a crisis like the economic crisis we had in the 90s or now, it's often if there's a small tuition payment, girls get the ones that are taken out of the school system. So I think you have to attack the problem from different dimensions. I don't think that there's any sort of one formula. And again, if you think about it, I guess that would be true if you look at the US too. I've been watching educational debates in the US, which is a far richer society, and clearly it's not just a question of how much money you throw at the problem. You have school systems that have large sums of money. And frankly, we also have bureaucratic impediments in the US. So this is not by any means to suggest that an excuse or rationalization for other performance, but we also need to look at this with a little bit of humility, because we've got a pretty rich country here and we're doing a crummy job of educating people.
You mentioned that you had chatted before with somebody from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I know that Nigel Holloway is with us tonight, and I'll call upon him. I think he's at this table over here to ask the last question.
Thank you very much. I wanted to talk about Afghanistan, or ask you a question about Afghanistan. You were saying, and I think The Economist agrees with you, that the concept of the third world has really disappeared, but we still have if you like, a rump of failing and fragile states around the world, of which probably Afghanistan is a leading candidate, in terms of our security and the security of many other nations. And my question is really about the interaction between economics and security, because we read of an official US report which assesses the mineral wealth of Afghanistan at about $1 trillion. And I think, for me at least, it enables me to see Afghanistan in an entirely new light. But clearly, after you first read the reports, then you think, well, how is the economy, how is the government going to actually exploit that opportunity? And it leads me to wonder whether we, the West, US, NATO, should really be bringing in India and China and other, serious players in terms of investment, not so much aid, but investment in some of these fragile states to help Afghanistan exploit this enormous opportunity. I'd like your comment on that, please.
Yes.
All right.
This is a topic that may be of broader interest, so let me approach this from a couple of different dimensions. I'm very proud of our team in Afghanistan. They've been doing courageous work under difficult circumstances. And it's a little, as you talked about with the fragile or conflict state, this is a subject of greater importance. And let me tell you kind of the lessons, the preliminary lessons we've learned. One, the government has to own it. If they don't own it, outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned, can't do it for them. And indeed, you run the risk of having projects that make people feel good or allow them to have a nice flag to say we've opened this school or that school, but if it's not tied to the educational system so there's any teachers to show up, it won't work. And this is a tension, and I know this because I've been in the US government. There's a tension to say get quick results, and this other government doesn't have the capacity, whether it be Haiti or Afghanistan. So let's go build it ourselves. Let's be can-do Americans. Let's go build this and do this and so on and so forth. What takes longer, but is longer lasting, is something where you sit down with the government and you figure out what, given the capacity, can you do together at this stage while building the capacity to do more. And let me give you a couple examples from Afghanistan. There has been a huge development in improvement of maternal health and infant mortality in Afghanistan because of a very basic preventive health care system that we helped set up with a good health minister using NGOs, some Afghan, some international, to provide basic preventive health care. Most of you have read about the educational system and bringing girls into schools. Same thing, good education minister. There's something called the National Solidarity Program, many of you are aware of. We set up with Ashraf Ghani, the finance minister, which is about $30,000 to $50,000 grants for communities. They have local councils. They decide how the money is to be spent. I visited a micro-hydro project, sometimes at schools. People then own these projects. We have cases where people would fight off the Taliban because they're their projects. Interestingly enough, the government is now saying, and this, one of the problems of Afghanistan is the centralized control versus decentralized system, is can we now use these local councils perhaps to develop other types of services? So connect it to the centralized system, but have, in a sense, a local sort of buy-in. Now, to make this system work, you need an honest minister, and you need this effort to try to build with them over time. So I'll give you a real-life example. Again, when I was in Afghanistan about a year ago, we'd done good work on education, we'd done good work, and by the way, if you go there, you'll see your cell phone works in most places. There's a pretty good cell phone system, reasonable microfinance, reasonable health. Agriculture is a huge opportunity. I went to President Karzai and I said, the guy you got is not going to do it. You know it, we know it. Now, there's huge opportunities for you to do something in agriculture. Give me somebody good in agriculture. About 3 or 4 weeks later, he did. And so you now got a very good agriculture minister, and we're starting to make some progress in this area. Minerals is the one that you then talked about. There's now a pretty good minerals minister. Not long ago, there wasn't such a very good minerals minister. And this connects to your point about outsiders. When I was in Kabul, I saw the NATO countries, the other major donors. I also asked, and it hadn't been set up on my schedule, to meet the Chinese ambassador. And as you probably know, I've worked with China over 20 years. And I knew at this time that China was starting to invest, including in the minerals industry. That Chinese ambassador was probably the strongest supporter of NATO I met, including of the NATO countries. Now, why was this? Because he knows security is a real thing, and they wanted to develop the minerals industry. There's a point, this is good to me. I mean, and so frankly, I'd worked when I'd been at the State Department to try to get China to recognize its interests in Afghanistan and, for that matter, Iraq. This is kind of the responsible stakeholder. But it's a question of, in life, if you try to tell people to do things that they don't really want to do, you don't have quite as good a success ratio. If you find mutual interests that serve everybody's interest and then try to figure out how to overcome the obstacles, you're likely to do better. So there's a couple morals in this. Is that one is that whether at Afghanistan or Haiti, it's not always easy, but it's not going to be long lasting unless you figure out a way to embed it in the country itself. And by the way, if you want to leave sometime, don't you think it's going to have to turn it over to them? And this may seem obvious, but let me tell you, most of the aid projects come from bilateral programs that are disconnected with the government's budget. Only about a third of the aid that goes to Afghanistan goes through the country's budget. Now, frankly, they don't have the capacity to deal with the full third, but they could do a lot more. You want to build the aid into the system. We run a multi-donor trust fund. We did it in Aceh, we do it in Afghanistan, we do it in Haiti. Now, one reason why you want to do this is if you've got 30 donors and a government barely has 5 people show up to the ministry, they're going to spend all their time meeting the donors doing, sort of show-off projects that don't really accomplish something. Isn't it better to put the money in one trust fund, work with the government with what capacity they have, and try to build some objectives and build their capacity as we go? So there are lessons to learn. Now, this doesn't mean that everything always works automatically. You got to have some security. You got to build this over time. I live in a world of probabilities. I mean, how can I increase the probabilities of success? And these are some of the lessons we've learned from Afghanistan.
Well, great. We've actually overshot the mark by 15 or 20 minutes, but I don't think a single person here regrets that and has not been fascinated by this.
Don't ask them to raise their hand.
I can't see anybody actually out there. Any event, I want to ask Noel Latif if he'd come up here, because he's going to just have a closing word to say. But as he comes up, let me just say that Bob had proposed a model of a conversation tonight, and I think, not many people can conduct a conversation like this. And I think you really did it in a way that kept everyone's attention for every second of this conversation. I said at the beginning that I know of no one in public life who seems to have a more developed concept of how all the things fit together and how economics relates to politics and power. And I think I think that was correct. And I also learned from Bob tonight. He said that one of his passions is that he wants to see this country stay engaged in the world, and that's what we're all about. That's what the Foreign Policy Association is about. So Noel, why don't you have the last word?
Well, let me just say that this evening has been a further vindication of the joint venture, the very successful joint venture between the Foreign Policy Association and the National Endowment for Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Bob Zoellick and Carl Gershman for a very stimulating and informative conversation. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.